I've been wanting to put my opinion on the Dark Tower series down for a long time, perhaps as soon as I finished up the first book, The Gunslinger. But to reflect on over 4,000 pages can be quite a struggle. So instead of trying to recap all of the artistic elements that I enjoyed or hated in these reviews, I want to pick out one or two that I find most poignant. So no hating on Odetta or Blaine or why in God's name there's a Wizard of Oz reference in this book, or even why Stephen King is a character in his own work. And the thing that I want to focus on for the Dark Tower series was villain creation. I wanted to talk about my favorite, Mordred Deschain. Now, there are many villains in the Dark Tower: Walter O'Dim, Rhea the Witch, the Crimson King, Blaine the Mono, and while some of these villains are actually quite good, none are quite as good as Mordred. So let's start at the beginning. First, I love the name. Mordred draws his name from Arthurian legend, so like the King Arthur stuff. His namesake was the bastard son of King Arthur, raised to hate his father. So even though the illusion is rather thinly veiled, right, it's quite literally just a representation of what Mordred is in this book, I'd guess that relatively few people know the full story of Mordred. Yet, there is some cultural apprehension about the name. When you hear Mordred, you know that this is a villain, this is an evil character. I really like it. I think the name's quite apt. Second, Mordred is mythical, and this comes from his name. His name comes from a mythical background, but even more so. Mordred has a creation story. Mordred is born of two fathers and two mothers, sort of a mythical creation story. And yeah, it's weird, but it almost feels like something you'd hear in a Greek or Aztec myth. In addition, each character in the Dark Tower series tells how baby Mordred comes to be in a different way. This is both fascinating and frustrating, and further leads into this mythological feeling about Mordred. There are demons, Star Trek-like teleportation of infants between wombs, a little bit of semen swapping, and who doesn't like that? And you know, looking back at all this, it really does make me realize how strange this series is, but in a sci-fi-esque, absurd-ish, strange way, it sort of paints Mordred in myth. Now, the birth of Mordred itself is where the true myth begins, and it's a true baptism in blood. He's guarded by Cantoi and the Taheen, so these are mutant rat people and these sort of Anubites. And Mordred comes into the world. So he's more formed than a normal baby, right? It's extraordinary, an extraordinary birth. Already with teeth, a keen awareness. It's like bringing a modern-day clarity to the birth of Hermes or something like that. And if you read about sort of these births, they'll come into the world already being clever, already representing the traits that they are. So a little bit more myth here. But King puts a demonic tint onto the entire thing by giving this baby a crimson birthmark and an engorged penis coming out of the womb. Fun. So in addition to this sort of mythological aspect of it, we go through these waves of both normal and extreme, which I think King does really quite well. The baby is cresting, and then we get these unearthly eyes. The baby starts yelling, just sort of like a normal baby, and then the mother is basically mad with love. The baby starts suckling, and it's sort of cute, and then, of course, the transformation. This, going back and forth, is quite a common theme in writers, and it keeps our attention quite well. The familiar to the unfamiliar, the hope to the despair. This kind of gets us sort of interested to read what's going to happen next, because we're sort of, we sense the pattern, but we don't necessarily know, because the extremes are so extreme, because the shift is so much, we don't necessarily know where we're going to end up in the end. This birth, of course, ends in a gunfight, because it wouldn't be the Dark Tower series if it didn't. The spider leaps between its victims, the spider that was once baby Mordred, and Susanna shoots off one of its legs before it skitters away. So in one sense, it's already quite the villain already. It's got this storied birth that's almost befitting of a Greek god. It's tainted with a hint of the disturbed, which is, you know, absolutely something that you have to admire King for. He sort of paints the disturbed better than most writers that I've known. And this is where most writers would stop in a normal villain. We'd sort of leave it at this. The spider would skitter off, and then we'd always, you know, maybe we'd see through its eyes every once in a while, or maybe we'd hear some skittering in the background. But what's lovely about this character is we get to see the world through Mordred's eyes, and empathetically so. So we get to see the world through the eyes of a myth. This is not unheard of, seeing the world through the eyes of a villain, and perhaps even empathizing with them. But most normal, or most villains that we get to see this with, are a little bit more normal as opposed to Mordred. It's almost like seeing the world through the eyes of an animal, and not, a Zootopia-esque animal, but this is truly what an animal would see. And Mordred is composed of such polar opposites that the view coming through his eyes is disorienting. We see things that we can so easily relate with. So we get the infant view, the powerless, the needing affection, the jealous of his father and mother's attention. But then we see through the spider, always feeding, because Mordred is hungry. The scene that's the most memorable scene in the entire series for me, and the scene that made me want to talk about Mordred to you guys, was the death of Walter O'Dim. And this is seen through Mordred's eyes. And I love this scene. It is the most viscerally disturbing scene that I perhaps have ever read. Mordred basically mind controls Walter, who is a villain throughout the story itself, a powerful villain, and has Walter dismember himself. King's description of Walter plucking his own eyes out and attempting to tear out his own tongue, that is, before Mordred becomes too impatient, has him bend down and stick it out so he can eat it out of him. This feeling of having a hairy giant spider suck on your tongue is one that will never leave me for the rest of my days. It is simply disturbing. And that we get to see this partially through the eyes of this spider, this basic force that is only hungry. It's really well done. And I think this is something you could only get from a character like this. And from that point on, regardless of what Mordred does, we know that he is a monster. So no matter how many times he transforms back into a person and pines for fellowship and conversation, King spends pages and pages trying to make you empathize with him, making him cold, making him jealous of his father's attention. Yet from that point on, you just can't empathize. You just can't feel for monsters under your bed. So while this scene is great in a disturbing sort of way, it's not absolutely perfect. And so while I like to comment on some of the good things the writers do, I think there are things that I disliked about this scene. It opens internal inconsistencies in the work. And while you can have an incredibly emotional, gripping piece of work with internal inconsistencies, for example, in Harry Potter, where gold is something that's valuable, and yet you can just wave your wand and transform things into gold, it kind of doesn't really make sense. If you don't address these things, it can become a little bit overbearing, especially when a lot of the work is less whimsical than something like Harry Potter. So, for example, Mordred has mind control power, right? He mind controls Walter O'Dim. Why doesn't he just mind control Roland? It's as if King has just completely forgot about this entire ordeal to make the book more interesting. The last scene could have just been, let's just mind control Roland and then let's get it done with pretty easily, but it's not. The final bit of Mordred, and this is sort of the final bit of villain writing, is his death, how Mordred comes to an end. So Mordred basically goes on the Oregon Trail. He dies of dysentery. So he eats Lippy, this is one of Dandelo's diseased horses, and basically starts shitting himself to death. And of course, the irony being that Mordred is basically a demigod that is dying of food poisoning. It's kind of fun, you get to sort of see this through his eyes, there is a little bit of irony there. Regardless, it pushes him to action. Compelled by his father on the verge of death, he strikes knowing basically that he will die. It's nice. Mordred's arc is in a way surreal, in a way mythological, and in a way incredibly human. And this juxtaposition, this combination, this emulsification, it created something that I thought was really quite good. There's no ceremony for Mordred in the end, not even a great relief. Mordred is not, in fact, the final villain of the book. But in a way, it's performative. Mordred was made for one purpose, driven towards it his entire short life. This should have inspired in the reader some sense of pity, but Mordred is so alien, so animalistic, so brutal, that he remained completely alien to me. His acts are described in too gory a detail to be quickly forgotten. So in summary, King uses an abundance of techniques and tricks to develop Mordred, and in this case he develops him in two contradictory ways, which gives this character quite a lot of flavor. That being said, for a writer, a creative in your own regard, you can use these techniques to go ahead and heighten a character in just one direction as well. But always note this contrast of flavors can really sort of bring characters to life. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion about villains in Stephen King's Dark Tower. If you like this, please leave a like. If you thought that there was something else that you'd like to add, or if you'd like me to go ahead and talk about anything else in the Dark Tower, please leave a comment below. It always helps to go ahead and subscribe, and I really appreciate you guys listening all the way through. Thanks.